Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Khan. I'm a research assistant here at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research. CSCR is an independent policy institution which looks at issues of international and domestic significance. Today, we welcome you to our latest segment of Experts Dispatch. In our Expert Dispatch, we invite various policy and research experts to discuss issues of both domestic and international relevance with us. Particularly, these issues are of explicit relevance to Pakistan. Today, in these times, we are currently observing growing tensions between China and the West on significant issues which relate to both their own policies and policies directed towards other countries. As a country which has historically been in close cooperation with both the West and the Chinese side, Pakistan has often found itself in a dilemma over its policy choices. We are lucky to have today with us Mr. Andrew Small. Mr. Andrew Small is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund. He also has extensive research experience on Pak-China relations, Chinese economic and foreign policy, and he also looks at problems related to EU-China relations and US-China relations. Previously, he has worked with several prestigious research institutions, including, but not limited to, the European Council on Foreign Relations. We welcome you here today, Mr. Andrew Small. Thank you for taking out the time to join us.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be able to do it.
So to commence our discussion, I would like to ask you about, we've seen that the Ladakh incident has left a negative image of China all over the world. And several Asian countries, including India and Japan, have been growingly hostile towards China. We also see that there have been organizations and institutions such as the Quad on the rise, and countries like India have often cited the rhetoric of a two-front war with both China and Pakistan. How probable do you think it is that other Asian countries can grow hostile towards China given this situation?
So I think you have two trends taking place simultaneously. One is, as you framed it in your introduction, there is an overarching US-China rivalry, and to a certain extent, wider systemic rivalry that's now taking place between China and the West. There's a cluster of advanced industrial democracies in Europe and in Asia as well, which in conjunction with the US are now clearly heading into a much more adversarial relationship with China. Simultaneously, China is in certain respects trying to build a bit of a coalition of its own. We see that with much closer China-Russia ties, and to some extent some adjustments in the approach that China's been taking with a number of its other partners, where I think it's looking to upgrade security ties really across the board. And we've seen in the last year or so the additional impetus from the Chinese side for instance, the establishment of new military facilities or the development of new military facilities elsewhere. We saw that in Tajikistan, we saw that in Cambodia. So I think you have this kind of rivalry intensifying, but it's not just about China. It's a wider, and it's not just about the US. It's about a kind of wider framework in which you have these increasingly self-reinforcing dynamics. So if you then look at that in the context that you raised it in East Asia, both of these trends are obvious. You have had a clear deterioration in China's relations and security relations with a number of its neighbors. It's certainly the case with India. It's certainly the case with Japan, as you suggest, but also indeed the disputes in the South China Sea are with a number of other claimants, and it is a security context in the neighborhood that is militarizing in quite an intense fashion. China's own naval buildup in the last few decades is particularly notable. I mean, on some metrics, China's transformed its navy to be a peer with the United States over the last few decades. And countries are looking to balance against that. And countries are also looking to respond to the heightened level of assertiveness with which China is seeking to enforce its claims, whether that's in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, with Taiwan, or at the border with India. And what we saw at the border with India was really a complete breakdown in the old mechanisms that had served very well for maintaining some degree of equilibrium in that relationship and handling some of these disputes effectively. I think that's really what played out, I think, demonstrates that those old mechanisms have broken. So I think this is going to continue and worsen on one track in all of this. I think we are going to see an increasingly adversarial set of security dynamics across the entire region. We've seen it to a certain extent in dynamics with China in South Asia. We see it in East Asia, but simultaneously, I think we will also have the trend in which China looks to build up and improve its ties with a discrete set of other partners as well. It's certainly the case with Pakistan, certainly the case with Russia. I think we see that to a certain extent with certain countries in Southeast Asia. If we're looking at Myanmar, if we're looking at Cambodia, if we're looking at Laos, even to a certain extent, the way China's handling its relations with North Korea. So I think you're going to get more of bloc politics, you're going to get more rivalry, but the dynamics are going to be those of not necessarily entirely rival coalitions, but certainly countries are going to come under more pressure to align, to choose sides, and some of the internal logic of this conflict is going to be harder for countries to avoid.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. And in relation to that question, as you've already spoken about the growing hostilities all over the region, and we do see that ideologically countries find themselves forced in a way to align with either side. But how probable do you think that, also keeping in mind the American engagement with Taiwan recently, which has really solidified this sort of ideological divide between the nations that will either have to choose this or that side? How do you see this in concrete terms affecting the militarization of the Asian region specifically?
So, I mean, I think Taiwan is obviously the biggest concern for a flashpoint that could engulf the entire region in war. I think that's unquestionably an exceptionally high risk in the next decade, and on some assessments, even in the nearer term. You have on the Chinese side a view that looking at the long-term trends in Taiwan in terms of kind of perceptions of Taiwanese or Chinese identity, opinion polling on China, you see a set of trend lines that I think look negative for them politically, in some ways reinforced by what's happened in Hong Kong, which has meant that the political parties that China had relied on to be, in some respects, a little more friendly, the nationalists, the KMT, the public opinion climate in Taiwan really shifted quite markedly after China, to a certain extent, walked away from the level of commitment it had had in the past to the one country, two systems approach that was agreed with Deng Xiaoping for how it was going to run Hong Kong. So on the political and economic side, a view that says that China is simply going to be able to reunify through political and economic means, I think has started to look more difficult. And the question has been, what is a time frame, therefore, in which China might consider using military means to enforce its claims? And we've seen in the last period of time, in conjunction, as was posed in the last question, with the considerable buildup in Chinese missile capacities, China's naval capacities, China's simply more able to do this already than it was a few years ago. It's in a much more kind of capable place, and its capacity to do this is expected to grow. These are trend lines that in certain respects have been moving in China's favor, not just in terms of the direct cross-straits military balance, but in terms of the relative military balance with the United States. How easy would it be for the United States to prevent China from taking certain forms of military action? It's clearly become much harder as a result of the significant improvement in Chinese military capabilities. So you're having, at the moment, this period of time in which, even before the visit of the US Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, a sense that China was pursuing a series of measures that some in Taiwan saw as more threatening. Simultaneously, on the Chinese side, the line that's often taken is that there is a salami slicing tactic, set of salami slicing tactics with Taiwan. China's very effectively squeezed out kind of formal diplomatic recognition. But in parallel to that, there are a lot of countries that have been looking to upgrade their political contacts with Taiwan and doing this in a certain sense in an incremental way to stay consistent with their policy, a one China policy that continues to recognize China as the sole diplomatic actor, but looks to integrate Taiwan into international bodies, bilateral contacts upgraded, and these sorts of things. So, and because of the perceived pressure from China militarily, I think the sense from various places, including in the United States, is that there needs to be more of a show of political support to Taiwan, partly as a means of deterrence, because exactly as you say in your question, I think with what happened in Ukraine, the fact that this would be incredibly damaging economically, but the global consequences would be so profound. But for China itself, there's profound risks in moving ahead with military action of this sort. It doesn't mean it won't happen. And I think countries are more concerned, I think, even than they were, that in light of the deep commitment that China has, that it continues to spell out to reunification, as they call it, with Taiwan, that you could have a repeat at some future juncture, where that future may not be so far into the future, of a Ukraine scenario on a scale that would be considerably worse, because you would have the direct military involvement of the United States, very, very likely, to some extent, the military involvement of Japan. So a Taiwan scenario is one that would involve very, very likely an outright US-China military conflict. Whether it was kept self-contained to the theater or whether it escalated beyond that is, of course, there's of course enormous risks in that happening. And going back to the previous question and this wider issue that there is right now, because you are having these hardening blocks, because it is taking on more of an ideological quality, because it's taking on something that seems almost more of an existential quality. I think the sense is that the willingness to move into forms of conflict, including outright war, the thresholds for that are, in one sense, lower than they were. Countries are more willing to take risks given the stakes that they see now for what this involves, and it's harder to back down on some of these positions. There's less pragmatism than there used to be, and that's certainly something that you see on the Chinese side. So I think the risks on all of this have increased considerably, and countries have to prepare for scenarios in which this might happen. Deterrence failed in the case of Russia and Ukraine. You can see it as a deterrence failure. You can see it as a failure of the capacity of the different parties to reach some sort of political agreement. I think the question is, is this something that can be addressed differently on either count, either effective deterrence that in the case of Taiwan, or that it's possible to reach some sort of political accommodation that can stabilize the situation, because I think the sense is very much that the risks there have escalated very, very considerably, and the next 5 to 10 years, and even the next 3 to 5 years on some metrics, looks like it could be a very concerning time, depending on how these windows are seen, because of course, everyone on the Taiwanese side and on the US side has also been trying to take their lessons, as the Chinese have too, from the Ukraine crisis. How do you ensure that, on one hand, Taiwan is more resilient against an invasion, on the other hand, that you don't allow a situation to develop in which Taiwan is able to build that level of resilience that would make an invasion such a difficult proposition. So the windows on this could move in somewhat unpredictable ways in the next period of time, depending on the changing balance of those assessments.
Okay, so we were seeing on one side this very difficult external environment for China, and we're seeing, as you've said, an increasingly complicating environment, both economically, politically, and also in terms of security. If we move from this broader focus to a narrower focus, considering China's own domestic problems and its problems in the international arena, when you look at Pakistan and China's relationship with Pakistan, historically, we've seen that it's been a rather relationship with some upheavals, some ups and downs, but they've both maintained a surface level at least, and they've continued this relationship into the present context. So looking at the Baloch militancy right now, the aggravating Baloch militancy and its possible links with the TTP movement, how do you see this insurgency affecting the Pak-China relationships? And secondly, how do you see the Afghan situation affecting this relationship? Because whatever happens in Afghanistan, it spills over into both Pakistan and China eventually. So how would you look at all of this?
So as you say, the security picture is having more of an impact on the China-Pakistan relationship and China's assessment of the situation, including for its investments, than had been the case really for the better part of a decade. I mean, you had a period around what played out with Lal Masjid, where you had a very kind of, you had a period in which threats to Chinese lives in Pakistan were very high. You had a number of incidents, kidnappings, killings, things like that. But there was a set of security measures that the Pakistani government put in place at that time that I think actually proved very effective in securing the situation for Chinese nationals, even before CPEC. And then after CPEC was established, all the negotiations, or a large portion of the negotiations in the run-up to CPEC were security focused on the Chinese side, how to ensure some level of safety for their personnel operating in Pakistan. And for a number of years, that the environment was secure. If you look at some of the incidents that did take place very occasionally to Chinese nationals, they were not operating under the security protection of the Pakistani government. It was kind of particular individuals, you know, someone who decides to cycle to Iran or something like that. When it came to the actual projects and things, you did not have any successful attacks for a very long period of time. So the period of the last year and a bit, last 18 months, has in some respects been exceptional. It goes back to a period in the late 2000s, really in terms of kind of the threat levels, but there's much larger economic presence on China's part, much larger numbers of people in the country. And so I think in some respects, the concern, that the risks are even greater than they were at that point, and there's more at stake on China's side. The economic dimensions of the China-Pakistan relationship are also much more significant than they were back 12, 15 years ago. So it has a bigger set of implications for the relationship as a whole when there are problems in these areas. And as you suggest in the question, it's some combination. I mean, distinctly, more than necessarily even the relations between the groups, but the Baloch dimension and the TTP dimension, as encapsulated by the two attacks in Dasu and the Confucius Institute in Karachi. I think it is going to be a period in which China will, again, as has been the case at certain points in the past, make the depth and level of its commitment to economic investments in the country contingent on a level of security being provided for its personnel. And if we go through a period of time in which that level of security is not provided, I think there will be a real shock. I think there will be a hit even to some of the existing projects that are there. Protection of Chinese nationals is kind of a critical matter for the Chinese government. You see that with Xi Jinping's personal involvement and the language used around the Dasuo attack, for instance. This is kind of a commitment that China's been, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party has really taken on, that they can secure the interests of the Chinese people, particularly in friendly countries like Pakistan. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on this. You've seen that to some extent in some of the discussions around whether China should be able to send some of its own security personnel and some of the debates that have gone on around this. And as you also suggested in the question, there is an Afghan dimension to this. China has seen some of these developments as bound up with the situation in Afghanistan, whether that's accurate or not. Certainly some of the groups have been operating in a cross-border context, not all of them, but in some of these instances, including some of what had been traced with the Dasuo attack, for instance. So I think there are a whole series of things that China is looking for from the Taliban as well, in terms of the assurances that they are willing to provide, not just with reference to groups like the TIP, the Uyghur militant group, but with respect to the activities of groups like the TTP. So I think what the net effect of all of this is, it's a higher risk period as China sees it, I think, for all of its economic activities in the neighborhood, and certainly in Pakistan as well, unfortunately, at the moment. And there will be these two tracks. There will be what China wants the Taliban to do to help ensure a more secure environment, including next door in Pakistan, but also the level of quality of the security protection provided by Pakistani security services, which, I mean, just had been notably effective for a sustained period of time. And I think the concern on China's part is that whether it's whatever one attributes it to, and I think it is certainly primarily attributed to the fact that the levels of activity from some of these groups have escalated, particularly on the Baluch side, but to some extent on the TTP side as well. In the last year, this is going to be a much more difficult time, and I think it will have an impact on the how China sees the risks of its economic activities in the region, and in worst case scenarios in which the security situation for its nationals really continue to deteriorate, they will pull people out. That would be, and you don't want to do that, it would be politically sensitive, but if things go in the wrong direction on some of this, they would back away from some of the project.
So you've spoken at length about the security situation and how that might be addressed in the context of Pak-China relations. In addition to that, we also hear about the economic imbalances that exist between Pakistan and China, specifically when we talk about how Pakistan has focused more on the import side instead of the export side. This is something that China has also itself brought up. And it is now particularly relevant because of CPEC and the entire BRI investment that China is making throughout the world. What other tangible improvements do you think Pakistan will need to show on different areas or different sectors, including the economic front, to be able to benefit from the CPEC investment? And not just in terms of, when we talk about economic development, we often see that it happens in bits and pieces, or some areas often get neglected. But when we talk about Pakistan as a developing country on the whole, how do you think Pakistan can benefit from CPEC?
So, I mean, first of all, the net picture that China's facing with the BRI, given the economic situation that a lot of countries are facing, is in a difficult place right now. I mean, Sri Lanka is the most obvious example in terms of what's gone on there. But I mean, countries right now are facing inflationary shock, challenges on debt across the board, massive rising energy prices, rising food prices, all of these things kind of bound together in a context in which these are problems that are facing developed countries too. The capacity for for G7 actors and things like that to be able to kind of step in and help in some of this is diminished right now by the fact that they're facing a lot of the same consequences themselves and are operating in more straitened conditions. So this isn't just a situation that Pakistan is navigating. This is taking place in a whole series of different contexts right now. And for China, of course, it means it's that all of the investments and commitments, financial commitments that it's been making, they're having to deal with all of this simultaneously. They're having to deal with a lot of debt renegotiations simultaneously. They're having to deal with a situation in which the economic risk assessment on their investments has shifted quite markedly. And China's own economy is probably facing some of the most difficult conditions since the early 90s for a host of different reasons, some of them primarily political, some of them reflecting the same shocks that others have experienced, but most of them actually, most of them more reflecting some of the internal choices that have been made in terms of the approach to the tech sector, the approach to the housing market, a whole series of measures that have been pursued by the Chinese government in the last period of time. So I think China's own capacity to navigate all of these crises comfortably and to treat the economic kind of ripple effects of these things as something they can just comfortably swallow. I mean, certainly in the context of the internal economic issues China's facing, it can afford to roll debt over and provide support for central bank financing and things like that. So it's not that it prevents that, but China's facing a certain number of pressures internally, and it's facing these pressures across a whole range of its different investments across the developing world, but not just the developing world. So when coming to kind of how one navigates this, I think one has to look at the wider context in which it's all playing out. So I think, first of all, it means that, of course, the macroeconomic picture has to stabilize to some extent before, as an absolute precondition. And to some extent, there have been elements that have been difficult from China's perspective since kind of late 2017. I mean, I think this is one of the, if you're going to say what's the single reason that there's been a degree of a slowdown in CPEC over the last few years, certainly there's the political dimensions to this, but there's also just been the macroeconomic picture has not, is not what it was in the period from 2014 to 2017 or something like that. So so I think the first thing is just some level of stabilization of the overall picture. I mean, fundamentally, what China wanted with all of this was to be able to bet on some relatively predictable level of ongoing growth in the country. Pick your number for what that might have looked like, but China just wanted they wanted to back that in some respects through what they would be doing to upgrade the infrastructure, how they'd be helping out to some extent. I mean, with the energy situation, they wanted to be a part of that long-term framework that would be about the economic transformation of Pakistan, and that they would slot in and reinforce and back various dimensions of what was going on with that. That was, I think, really what was envisaged as well in to some extent with the long-term plan, but the entire framework that was originally laid out with this. So I still think the first piece of this is some level of stabilization of the overall economic picture, and then a long-term framework that China can buy into again, because I'm not sure at the moment that I think at the moment it's very absorbed with the short-term questions of, and it's been a rolling set of short-term questions really since around late 2017. It's been questions around government, questions around the elections, questions around dealing with short-term economic crises. And I think to get to a level of deeper commitment again and to move things forward, there needs to be some level of confidence in the medium-term and longer term outlook, and in a way that China had when it embarked on this in the first place. And I think back in 2014, 2015, it really had that confidence and wanted to kind of swing in behind that. Of course, there's then a whole series of much more kind of micro level, kind of practical elements to this as well, that were kind of challenges for China, and where it's kind of taken stock and had to make some of its reassessments. I mean, I think there was a question whether this very large scale kind of package model, does this entirely make sense? Was this the optimal way of advancing economic relations between the two sides? Does it maybe simply make sense to do this in a more incremental way, to move around certain opportunities more opportunistically, not to overload expectations on some of these things, including with, I mean, there was certainly a view at certain points that, you know, the system on the Pakistani side should be able to operate in a much more centralized way, that all of the local issues could be dealt with very quickly. It could operate a little bit more like how China did its own economic development. But there are good reasons for that not to happen. There are good reasons to allow more local input, to allow some of the other stakeholders to influence the decisions, rather than this being kind of done by fear from the top. So I think necessarily some of these were obstacles that should be overcome. I mean, it should be possible to figure out ways to get appropriate land allocations and entry and access routes for special economic zones and things like that. I mean, there's some very kind of low-level things that, yes, an engaged government at the center that's able to like crunch through and push these things through should be able to do this in a way that's nevertheless able to be appropriately sensitive to some of the local needs and concerns and things as well. So I think there's a kind of adaptation period, even in benign circumstances, that another phase to figuring out what actually is the right balance on all of this. In the right kind of set of circumstances, then yes, this could have, or theoretically still could turn into something that generates significant employment and is able to have some level of transformative effect in particular economic sectors. But I think there's going to have to need to be a kind of a rebuilding of confidence or recalibration of what the entire purpose of the exercise is. I think there was some clarity about what that was a few years ago. Of course, many of these projects are still being executed, but I think maybe in light of events, it's good for both sides, particularly once we have something that looks like a longer term government in place again, to retake stock and figure out what most mutual economic relationship needs to look like. What do you salvage from CPEC? If you are able to deal with all the outstanding concerns, payments to Chinese power firms, all the kind of irritants and things, if you were able to deal with that really in light of the events of the last 7-8 years of CPEC's history, what is that one would take and apply in a future for some of the future economic ventures? And I don't think there's at this moment in time that level of kind of strategic step back overview, or that it's necessarily possible at the moment. I think as long as we're still dealing with an immediate economic crisis, the most important thing that China is going to be able to do is not long-term CPEC investments. Is going to be helping to get through the very near term, helping to stabilize finances, and do what it can in that regard in conjunction with international financial institutions, the IMF and others. So I think it's just hard to do long-term planning while the situation is what it is. And this is not just the usual kind of cycle for Pakistan on these things. This is the global picture looks like what it looks like, and clear in the next couple of years whether that's going to in respecting for now. I think there's going to be a lot more crisis management, but at some juncture I think one needs to go back to what a genuine long-term plan for this economic relationship should look like again, think that through, know what the irritants are that kind of got in the way of being able to move on some of these fronts in the last phase, and revisit what makes sense, which I suspect is not going to mean the same scale, but scale isn't necessarily the most important thing when it comes to some form of effective economic cooperation.
Thank you so much for those wonderful responses, Mr. Andrew. And I'm sure viewers who would like to learn more about the Pakistan-China relationship and how it relates to the international order and how it really plays out in the geopolitical scenario would love to read your book titled The China-Pakistan Axis for more detail. And this concludes our segment for today. We hope that you've had a very informative session with our expert dispatch. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.